Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are cracking open a 50-year-old cold case from the history of AI. It's a story full of rivalry, big ideas, and a book that was literally accused of murder.
So, picture this. It's 2006, and at a conference, one of the godfathers of AI, Marvin Minsky, gets asked straight up if he's the guy who killed off neural networks back in the 70s. And after a bit of a rant, he just shouts this wild confession. So, was he really the villain of this story? To figure that out, we have to jump in our time machine and investigate a genuine mystery. The sudden, unexpected death of the very first neural networks. You know, the ancestors of the tech that's completely changing our world right now.
All right, let's dive right into this mystery. First up, the scene of the crime.
Okay, so in the late 1960s, you've got this incredibly exciting field called connectionism. The whole idea was to build brain-like neural networks. And then, all of a sudden, it just stopped. The funding dried up, the labs moved on, and the whole field entered this deep freeze that became known as the first AI winter.
To really get what happened, you need to understand that in the early days of AI, they were basically two rival gangs in town, and they had two completely different, almost opposite ideas about what intelligence even is.
In one corner, you had the symbolic AI camp. Let's call them the NEETs. For them, intelligence was clean, it was logical, it was based on rules that smart humans could write down. And in the other corner, you had the connectionists, the scruffies. They believed intelligence wasn't programmed, it emerged, messily, from simple networks that learned from data, kind of like how our brains work.
Minsky, a leader of the NEETs, was a pure mathematician at heart. He had this very particular vision. He argued that a single, uniform network of neurons was just way too simple. Real intelligence, he thought, had to be a society of different, specialized little programs, all working together to get things done.
And his collaborator, Seymour Papert, had an even bigger, more philosophical problem with it. He worried that these big, uniform neural nets were a threat to different ways of thinking. He saw it as a kind of cognitive monoculture that would just flatten out human creativity.
So, we have our suspects, we've got their motives. Now let's talk about the alleged murder weapon. For decades, the story that got passed around was that this one single book was basically a calculated takedown. The legend says it delivered this mathematical knockout punch, proving that the Scruffy's neural networks, called Perceptrons, were a total dead end. Now, this is where the story gets really interesting. Just look at the timing here. The book comes out in 1969, right? But check it out. The frustration in all the big AI labs had already been building since the mid-60s. So the book didn't start the fire, it landed on a field that was already starting to burn out.
And yet, this became the official story, that the book showed a simple neural net couldn't even solve a basic logic problem called XOR, and that this scared off all the funders, killed morale, and put the whole field on ice for 20 years. But this version of the story leaves out the most important clue.
If you take a closer look at the evidence, you find a major plot twist. When you do an autopsy on the field of connectionism from back in the 60s, you find something nobody talks about.
Yeah, the autopsy record basically blows the whole case wide open. It all comes down to this one question: was this field already on its deathbed before the book ever hit the shelves? You see, that XOR problem, it wasn't just some clever gotcha in a book. Oh no, it was the perfect example of the massive brick wall that everyone in the field had slammed into. They knew single-layer networks were too simple. The obvious answer was to add more layers, make them deep. But there was one gigantic problem. This slide just lays out the trap perfectly. They knew they needed networks with multiple layers, but they had absolutely no idea how to train the hidden layers in the middle. It's like trying to teach a student by only looking at the final answer on their test, with no clue how they got there. It was a complete and total dead end.
So here it is, the big reveal. The real killer wasn't a book. It was a missing piece of the puzzle, a crucial algorithm we now call backpropagation. Without it, the whole field was basically on life support. By the time Minsky and Papert's book actually came out, most of the big research labs had already thrown in the towel out of pure frustration.
And hey, you don't have to take my word for it. Here's a quote from a researcher who was right there in the trenches at the time. He confirms it. This wasn't some secret Minsky revealed. It was the elephant in the room that was slowly crushing the entire field.
So, if Minsky wasn't the devil who killed neural networks, then what was he? And what does this whole 50-year-old story really tell us about the AI we're all living with today?
The verdict is in. Minsky and Papert? They weren't the killers. Their book,
Perceptrons was the epitaph. It didn't cause the death, it just documented it. It wrote the obituary for a field that had already failed on its own technical terms, and in the process, it became a really convenient scapegoat.
But wait, there's one last twist. Their book wasn't just about the technical problems of the 1960s. Their deeper, their real argument was that this entire approach could never scale up. They were convinced that even if you could train them, these networks would always be stuck solving tiny, toy problems and would never achieve anything close to real intelligence.
This number, 1.7 trillion, that's the number of parameters in just one of today's big AI models. This is the exact kind of massive scale that Minsky and Papert were absolutely certain was not only impractical, but just fundamentally the wrong path to building a mind.
And that is the ultimate irony of this entire story. The NEETs, the people who valued elegant, provable, human-designed logic, turned out to be spectacularly wrong about the brute force power of scale. The Scruffies ended up winning, not because their first attempt was perfect, but because just making everything bigger, way, way bigger, unlocked abilities that nobody in the 1960s could have possibly dreamed of.
This history leaves us with one last, really provocative thought. The brilliant, literal founders of AI were positive they understood the fundamental limits of this technology, and they were completely wrong. So it makes you wonder, what are the obvious limitations of today's AI? The things we're all short it can never ever do, that future generations are going to look back on and just laugh at?